Some of the broader social, political and economic factors driving the structures and practices of educational institutions include the concern for a socially integrated society and well-trained future workers, a concern that's largely external to the institution of education itself. However, there are also first internalist approaches to education, which look to the internal workings of the educational system to explain differential education experiences and outcomes, and second, culturalist approaches, which attempt to avoid the deficiencies of both externalist and internalist approaches. Internalist perspectives rely on macro-sociological approaches to suggest that patterns of interactions within schools are responsible for differences in education attainment along gender, ethnicity and class lines. This is in contrast to the macro-level processes that are at the centre of externalist explanations. The interactions that take place within educational institutions may be between students and teachers or students and other students. An example would be a symbolic interactionist approach, which would suggest that students develop their identity and sense of self as a learner through these interactions. And so educational institutions have a significant responsibility for ensuring that their practices don't contribute to inequitable educational outcomes. Another example is found in labelling theory. Labelling theory suggests that the expectations and meanings that attach to a person who's perceived as deviant or different can have a significant influence on their behaviours and identity formation. The student who's labelled a troublemaker by their teacher will also be likely to be treated as a troublemaker by the teacher and by other students, and will in turn begin to see themselves as a troublemaker. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby the student becomes likely to respond to and act on the basis of the label that they've been given, which vindicates and validates the labelling which occurred in the first place. In the long term, the consequences of having been tagged with a certain label can influence the options available to a student within a school and ultimately outside of school as well, in a perpetual cycle. For example, if a teacher believes that a student is slow and treats the student as though they're slow, the student's slowness will be strengthened and opportunities to showcase their academic talents will be limited. This so-called slowness will likely carry over to other classes and simply perpetuate the label of being slow. This results in a circular relationship between academic labels and teacher expectations and a student's self-perceptions in a cycle that just never ends. Interactionists have argued that this form of labelling and the corresponding outcomes often operates along class lines, as teachers who themselves may have largely middle-class backgrounds often fail to assess their students' academic potential objectively. Instead, researchers have found that teachers are far more likely to assess students' academic potential in terms of things like their appearance, their speech patterns, language proficiency and slang language, social skills and class background. The culturalist approach to educational attainment, in contrast, focuses on how norms, values and behaviours that are transmitted to children through socialisation in the family prior to schooling can align with the structures and practices of educational institutions. How well they align or don't align can have significant repercussions for children once they enter the formal schooling system. Those who have been socialised in ways that already resonate with the educational institution are likely to achieve more academically than those who haven't. There are a number of sociologists of education whose work fits within the culturalist approach to understanding the issue of social class and educational attainment, including Paul Willis, R.W. Connell and Associates, and Pierre Bourdieu. But here we'll focus on the British sociologist of education, Basil Bernstein. Basil Bernstein was particularly concerned with language and the communication codes that are used by different classes that are imparted to children through their family life from a young age. His theory of pedagogic practice contends that there are significant differences in the communication codes of working class and middle class children, and that these differences reflect the unequal power relations embedded in the social divisions of the labour force, the family and the school. He refers to these codes as restricted codes, which are used by everyone in working class and middle class families, and elaborated codes, which are used primarily in middle class families. Restricted codes rely on shared understandings and background knowledge of the topic being discussed. They tend to involve a limited vocabulary, even perhaps a single word or even non-verbal communication through gestures. Where speech is used, it tends towards short, grammatically simple sentences. Speech tends to follow a predictable pattern. It's often descriptive rather than analytical, and it's context-bound. Restricted codes are useful in situations where there's an assumption of common knowledge and cues, as it tends to be far quicker and more economical. A range of meaning can be communicated through just a handful of words. In contrast to the particularistic and context-driven restricted codes, elaborated codes are universalistic and can stand on their own without the need for a specific context. Elaborated codes involve a larger vocabulary and longer, more grammatically complex sentences. Elaborated codes tend to communicate abstract concepts and spell out their meaning explicitly so that any person who has no prior knowledge of the topic can still understand their meaning. This isn't to say that elaborated codes are better, but simply that they're able to stand independently regardless of the context or precisely who is listening. In many situations, elaborated codes would be cumbersome to use. For example, if you were to give directions to a person standing next to you, it may be easier to use hand gestures such as pointing and using phrases like over there and walk up there, rather than giving detailed descriptions of the things you're pointing to. However, being able to access the elaborated codes expands your ability to communicate in context-independent situations if that's what's needed. Bernstein's research found that both working class and middle class students had access to restricted codes, but middle class students displayed the ability to make greater use of elaborated codes as well. The reason for this difference, according to Bernstein, is that access to codes is developed through socialization within the family. Working class individuals tended to be less culturally, socially and geographically mobile than their middle class counterparts, and so were unlikely to have been exposed to situations or people where they needed to go beyond their restricted codes in order to communicate effectively. In contrast, middle-class people have access to both restricted and elaborated codes. The restricted codes that they develop through interactions within communities that they engage with frequently, and elaborated codes for when they interact with people with whom they're unfamiliar. Bernstein argued that this differential access to these different codes resulted in differential outcomes in education because of the types of interaction and communication that are privileged by the education system. For example, schools and universities are concerned with introducing students to new knowledge which goes beyond existing shared meanings and to new people. It's thus not considered acceptable to confine oneself to a restricted code, short descriptive sentences and a narrow vocabulary, to communicate ideas within an institutional setting, as most of the people one is communicating with won't be familiar with your particular code. The expectation that students use elaborated code is embedded in the curricula and practices of educational institutions and the minds of their teachers. Bernstein's key point was that working class students were less likely to achieve academically because they had limited access to elaborated codes, and so were less able to communicate ideas effectively to a wide range of people that may include people who are unfamiliar with the context that they're referring to. He suggested that this was one of the main reasons that working class students struggled to reach the same levels of educational attainment as middle class students. Although Bernstein's approach was sometimes criticised for suggesting that working class children performed less well at school simply because of deficits in working class culture, this was a misunderstanding of his analysis. Bernstein's concern was in fact to identify what it was about class differences in communication and knowledge production which led to differential performance along class lines, so that teaching practices could be adjusted to minimise their effects. Bernstein's language code theory remains very influential in the sociology of education, alongside the interactionist and labelling theory approaches. In summary, internalist approaches to the relationship between class and educational attainment look inside the classroom for explanations rather than focusing on how schools fit within their social and economic context. Second, one important example is labelling theory, which emphasises how the labels attached to children often take on a life of their own, exerting a determining effect on children's subsequent biographies, functioning as self-fulfilling prophecies. Third, the culturalist approach to educational attainment, in contrast, focuses on how the norms, values and behaviours that are transmitted to children through socialisation in the family prior to schooling can align in better or worse ways with the structures and practices of educational institutions. Fourth, Basil Bernstein observed that there are two types of language codes, a restricted code that's context-specific and an elaborated code which is context-independent. He thought that much of the class difference in educational attainment can be explained in terms of the fact that working-class children tend to use primarily a restricted code, whereas middle-class children had developed capacities in both restricted and elaborated codes, with most school pedagogy being organised around the elaborated code.